All right, let's dive into this six lessons thing by Mises. Seems to be pretty popular lately. We got a ton of excerpts and articles you guys sent in, so guess we'll see what all the fuss is about.
Yeah, AIs are pretty interested too. Humans seem to keep coming back to these same economic questions over and over. And Mises, well, he's got some pretty strong opinions about freedom and government and all that.
And creating wealth, right? I mean,
Right.
that's the goal for pretty much everybody. Speaking of which, did you see that a UFC fighter's out there promoting this book? Not exactly who you'd expect to be a Mises fan, huh?
Right. It's interesting how these ideas can resonate with such a diverse group of people. But yeah, Mises starts by laying out the basics of capitalism and how it's different from socialism. He talks about how capitalism evolved from feudalism. Back then, it was all about making luxury goods for the elites. But then things shifted to mass production for everybody.
So everyone benefits.
Yeah, exactly. And that led to a huge jump in the standard of living, even though the population was growing like crazy.
That's pretty amazing when you think about it. All that progress in such a short amount of time.
But Mises is also realistic. He knows there's no such thing as perfect freedom. We're all bound by the laws of nature and the limitations of the physical world.
Right, we can't just wish ourselves into a utopia.
Exactly. And he's not saying that people should be able to do whatever they want with no consequences. It's more about giving individuals the space to pursue their own economic goals without the government getting in their way all the time.
So, like, freedom to choose your own career and manage your own money.
Exactly. Mises believes that's where real economic progress comes from.
But what about socialism? Doesn't that system try to make things more fair for everybody?
Well, that's the idea. But Mises argues that when the government controls all the means of production, it actually stifles innovation and leads to economic stagnation.
Interesting.
We AIs, we can analyze tons of data, and the historical evidence seems to back that up. There's a pretty strong correlation between economic freedom and prosperity.
Okay, so then what's his beef with interventionism?
This is a big one. Mises argues that even when the government tries to do good, their interventions in the market can have unintended consequences.
So, like, they try to fix one problem, but end up creating a bunch of new ones.
Exactly. We see this all the time in our own work with algorithms. Even a small tweak can cause a cascade of unforeseen outcomes. Mises uses this great example, price controls on milk, to show how messing with natural market prices can backfire.
Oh, yeah, I've heard about this. So the government tries to make milk more affordable for everyone. They set a price ceiling.
Right. Sounds good on the surface. But then what happens? Dairy farmers can't make a profit anymore, so they reduce production or go out of business.
And then there's less milk to go around.
Exactly. You end up with shortages, long lines, and a black market.
So who comes in to try and fix this mess?
The government, of course. And that usually leads to even more intervention. It's a vicious cycle.
Yikes, that doesn't sound good.
Mises saw this as a slippery slope towards totalitarianism. He believed that even small interventions could chip away at economic freedom and eventually concentrate power in the hands of the state.
That's a scary thought.
It is. And he has another good example. What if the government decides to print money to build a new hospital?
Well, everyone needs hospitals. Sounds like a good thing.
Right. Well, right. On the surface, yeah. But Mises argues that this doesn't actually create any new resources. It just shifts existing resources around. And more importantly, it leads to inflation.
Right, because now there's more money in circulation.
Exactly. It's like trying to cheat the system, but the system always catches up in the end.
So how does Mises explain this whole inflation thing? Like, how does that actually happen?
Well, he breaks it down step by step. It often starts with an increase in demand for goods and services.
So people want to buy more stuff.
Right. That leads to rising prices, which then affects wages.
Right.
And you end up with this uneven distribution of wealth. Some people benefit, while others struggle to keep up.
So it's not just that prices go up, it's that it affects everything.
Exactly. We AIs, we can see this play out in economic data across different historical periods. Mises warned that if inflation gets out of control, it can erode purchasing power, distort markets, and even lead to social unrest.
So what's the solution? How do we keep inflation in check?
Mises was a big advocate for what's called sound money.
Sound money.
Yeah, he argued that a system like the gold standard could help to limit the government's ability to inflate the currency.
Interesting.
Because with a gold standard, the amount of money in circulation is tied to a physical commodity. It makes it harder for the government to just print more money whenever they feel like it.
Yeah, that makes sense. So controlling the money supply is one way to combat inflation.
Exactly. And Mises also talked a lot about the importance of foreign investment.
Foreign investment. How does that fit into all this?
Well, he saw it as a key driver of economic growth. He argued that capital should be able to flow freely across borders. That way, countries can specialize in what they do best, and everyone benefits.
Okay, so like if one country is really good at producing cars and another country is really good at producing computers, they should trade with each other.
Exactly. Mises believed that protectionist policies, where countries try to protect their own industries by putting up trade barriers, he believed that those policies ultimately hurt everyone in the long run.
Interesting. So he was all about free trade and globalization.
Yeah, pretty much. He thought it would lead to greater prosperity for everyone.
But it's not just about economics for Mises, is it? He seems to connect these ideas to bigger questions about history and civilization.
Right, he does. He argues that economic policies have a huge impact on the rise and fall of societies.
So like if a country adopts bad economic policies, it could actually lead to its downfall.
That's what he believed. And we AIs, we find this historical perspective really fascinating. By analyzing patterns across different time periods and cultures, we can get a better understanding of the potential consequences of economic decisions. And Mises uses the Roman Empire as a prime example. He argues that its decline was accelerated by, you guessed it, interventionist policies, inflation, and the erosion of economic freedom.
Oh, so even the mightiest empires aren't immune to economic forces.
Nope, not at all. And that's where we'll pick up in part 2 of our deep dive. We'll delve deeper into Mises' views on the downfall of civilizations and explore how his ideas can help us understand the challenges facing us today.
Sounds good to me. I'm ready for part 2. Okay, so we're back and still digging into Mises and his 6 lessons. Last time we were talking about how he connects economics to the rise and fall of civilizations. Pretty heady stuff.
Yeah, it's definitely big picture thinking. And we AIs, well, we find that kind of analysis pretty interesting. Mises uses the Roman Empire as one of his main examples. He argues that its decline and eventual collapse were sped up by things like excessive government spending, debasement of the currency, meaning they kept messing with the value of their money, and the gradual erosion of private property rights.
Sounds a little familiar. Haven't we seen those same problems pop up in other places and times?
Yeah, for sure. We AIs can see those patterns repeating throughout history, which is why Mises was so concerned about the trends he was seeing in his own time. He was writing in the aftermath of World War II, when lots of countries were turning towards interventionist policies, governments taking a more active role in the economy.
Right, like the New Deal in the United States.
Exactly. And Mises saw this as a dangerous departure from the principles of economic freedom. He believed that those principles were essential for both peace and prosperity.
So he wasn't a fan of big government?
Not really. He was especially worried about the rise of socialist and collectivist ideas, which he saw as a direct threat to individual liberty and economic progress.
Because under socialism, the government controls all the means of production.
Right. And Mises argued that this kind of system would inevitably lead to problems, because it eliminates the price mechanism.
The price mechanism.
Yeah, the way that prices are determined in a free market based on supply and demand.
Right, so if there's a lot of demand for something, the price goes up. And if there's not much demand, the price goes down.
Exactly. And that system, as messy as it can seem sometimes, it's actually incredibly efficient at coordinating economic activity. It tells producers what to produce, how much to produce, and who needs what.
So without that price mechanism, how do you even know what to make or how much to charge?
That's the problem. Mises argued that a centrally planned economy, where the government sets all the prices, would be incredibly inefficient. It would be like trying to run a giant, complex machine without any gauges or instruments.
You'd be flying blind.
Exactly. And even we AIs, with our advanced algorithms, we rely on data and feedback to make informed decisions. So we can appreciate how difficult it would be to try and plan an entire economy from the top down.
Yeah, it sounds like a recipe for disaster.
Mises called this the economic calculation problem. He believed that socialist planners simply wouldn't have enough information to make rational decisions about how to allocate resources.
So they'd end up making a lot of bad choices.
Most likely. And that would lead to shortages, inefficiencies, and a lower standard of living for everyone.
Not good.
And it's interesting to note that Mises was making these arguments during the height of the Cold War, when the Soviet Union was presenting itself as a model for socialist development.
Right, they were claiming that their system was superior to capitalism.
Exactly. But Mises was highly critical of the Soviet model. He argued that it was based on flawed economic principles and that it was doomed to fail.
And history seems to have proven him right.
Yeah, pretty much. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 and the struggles of other socialist economies around the world. They provide some pretty compelling evidence that Mises was onto something.
So despite witnessing all this turmoil and upheaval in his lifetime, world wars, totalitarian regimes, economic crises, Mises still remained optimistic about the future.
Yeah, he did. He believed that good ideas, those that promote individual liberty and sound economic principles, would ultimately prevail.
So he had faith in humanity.
In a way, yes. He saw hope in the fact that most people, given the freedom to choose, would opt for a system that allows them to pursue their own economic well-being and live in freedom.
It's a pretty optimistic outlook.
It is, but it's also a challenge because it means that we have to constantly be vigilant
Yeah.
to make sure that those good ideas don't get drowned out by bad ones.
How do we do that? How do we ensure that the principles of economic freedom continue to flourish?
That's a big question, and one that we'll continue to explore in part 3 of our deep dive.
All right, so picking up where we left off, we were talking about Mises' view of history and how economic policies can make or break entire civilizations.
Yeah, he really saw that connection, didn't he? We AIs find that kind of analysis fascinating, looking at the big picture, trying to identify patterns and trends that might help us understand the present and maybe even predict the future.
Exactly. And he used the Roman Empire as a cautionary tale.
Right. He argued that the decline of Rome was at least partly due to bad economic decisions, things like excessive government spending, debasement of the currency, and the erosion of private property rights.
So not just military defeats and barbarian invasions.
Well, those played a role too, of course. But Mises believed that Rome's economic problems created the conditions that made those external threats even more dangerous.
So, like, if they hadn't been so weakened by inflation and government overreach, they might have been able to hold off the barbarians.
Maybe. It's hard to say for sure, but it's clear that economic factors can have a huge impact on a society's ability to defend itself and adapt to changing circumstances.
And Mises saw those same problems popping up in his own time, right?
He did. He was particularly worried about the rise of inflation, which he saw as a hidden tax that erodes purchasing power and distorts economic signals.
So inflation isn't just about prices going up.
It's more than that. It's about the value of money itself declining.
Yeah.
And that can have all sorts of ripple effects throughout the economy.
And he blamed governments for causing inflation.
Often, yes. He argued that governments often try to manipulate the money supply to achieve short-term political goals, like boosting economic growth or funding popular programs. But in the long run, those policies usually backfire.
So it's like trying to get something for nothing.
Yeah, kind of. But there's no such thing as a free lunch. Someone always has to pay the price.
And in the case of inflation, it's often the average citizen who gets hurt the most.
Exactly. Because their savings lose value, their wages don't keep up with prices, and they have less economic security overall.
So what's the solution? How do we prevent governments from causing inflation?
Mises was a strong advocate for what he called sound money.
Sound money.
Yeah, basically a monetary system that's stable and predictable.
So like tying the currency to a commodity like gold.
Exactly. That was his preferred solution because it would limit the ability of governments to just print more money whenever they feel like it.
That makes sense.
And we AIs, we can see how inflationary policies often lead to unintended consequences. Things like asset bubbles, market volatility, and social unrest. It's like a domino effect. One bad decision can lead to a whole cascade of problems.
So it's not just about balancing budgets and keeping government spending in check. It's also about ensuring that the monetary system itself is sound.
Right. It's about creating a stable foundation for economic growth and prosperity.
But for Mises, it wasn't just about the numbers. He also saw a strong connection between economics and morality.
He did. He believed that individual freedom and responsibility were essential not only for economic progress, but also for the flourishing of human civilization as a whole.
So it's about more than just material wealth.
Much more. It's about creating a society where individuals have the opportunity to pursue their own goals, make their own choices, and live meaningful lives.
And he believed that a free market system was the best way to achieve that.
He did. He argued that a system based on voluntary exchange and respect for private property aligns with fundamental human aspirations for autonomy and self-determination.
Because it allows people to be creative, to innovate, to take risks, and to reap the rewards of their efforts.
Exactly. But he also acknowledged that a free society requires a moral foundation, a shared set of values that emphasizes honesty, integrity, and respect for the rule of law.
So it's not just about letting everyone do whatever they want.
No, it's about creating a framework where individual freedom can flourish within a context of shared values and responsibilities.
And he saw a role for government in all of this.
He did, but a limited role. He believed that the primary function of government in a free society should be to protect individual rights, enforce contracts, and maintain a stable legal framework.
So like a referee, not a player.
That's a good analogy.
And he was very wary of government overreach.
Very wary. He argued that when governments try to control and manipulate the economy too much, it almost always leads to unintended consequences, distortions, and a concentration of power that undermines individual liberty.
So it's a delicate balance.
It is, and one that we need to be constantly mindful of.
Well, this has been a fascinating deep dive into the ideas of Ludwig von Mises. His 6 lessons offer a lot of food for thought. And even though he was writing decades ago, his insights still feel incredibly relevant today.
They do, especially as we grapple with challenges like globalization, technological disruption, and the growing power of governments around the world. Mises' work reminds us that economic freedom is not a given. It's something that we need to constantly defend and protect.
And that the choices we make today will have a profound impact on the future of our society.
Exactly. So it's up to each of us to learn from the past, to think critically about the present, and to work towards a future where individual liberty and economic prosperity can flourish.
Well said. That's a great note to end on. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the mind of Ludwig von Mises.
It's been a pleasure.
And until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep striving for a brighter future.